When I was 8 years old, my biggest fear was that I would become bipolar. See, my grandmother has bipolar disorder, a condition characterized by severe high and low moods and changes in sleep, energy, thinking, and behavior. This places me at a notably greater risk for bipolarity, as it is the most genetic major psychiatric condition, and considering other mental illnesses in my family, the possibility always seemed higher to me. So, naturally, I was worried, but not for the reasons you might expect. When I stated my 8-year-old self's biggest fear at the beginning of this speech, I said that it was that I would become bipolar, not that I would have bipolar disorder or be affected by bipolarity. And I said this because that's the way I had always thought of and been taught to think of mental illness. See, I didn't really know what bipolar disorder was. What I knew was that it was a mental illness, and from what I had learned, that meant everything. I thought that if I had bipolar disorder, if I had depression, if I had anxiety, if I had any mental illness, I would become that very illness. Unfortunately, many people today still hold this antiquated point of view, and as a result, we have developed a stigma in our society that plagues people every day. Before I begin to talk about how this stigma shrouds mental illness, I want to define mental illness itself first. According to the American Psychiatric Association, a mental illness is a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is associated with present distress or disability or with a significantly higher risk of suffering death, pain, disability, or an important loss of freedom. It is a manifestation of not only behavioral and psychological factors, but of biological factors as well. Despite this given definition, the APA also notes that no definition can adequately specify the precise boundaries of the concept of mental illness, that it lacks a consistent operational definition that covers all situations. This acknowledgement in itself emphasizes the important point that every person's experience with mental illness is different, even those with the same diagnosis. Now, I want to tell you about how this stigma affects our society and how it affects individuals. And I want to do that by telling a story. So, I have a friend. Yes, I know, big surprise. I have a friend who has ADHD. For simplicity's sake, let's call them Beyonce. Now, when I asked Beyonce what it was like to live with ADHD, she told me about second grade. You see, in second grade, Beyonce's teacher, like many, assigned specific work for a specific period of time. If you finished the work early, you were expected to wait silently at your seat. Now, being the extremely bright and hyperactive student she was, Beyonce would finish the work meant for 20 to 30 minutes in about 5 to 10, which, if you can do the math, leaves a lot of time for waiting silently, which that was the part she struggled with sometimes. Although she enjoyed reading, drawing, and other non-disruptive stimulating activities, the teacher refused to consider any alternatives to her regimented structure, despite requests not only from Beyonce, but from Beyonce's parents as well. Instead, the teacher singled Beyonce out as a source of trouble. Although she was demonstrating clear symptoms of ADHD, the teacher refused to allow her to participate in these coping activities or to recommend her for ADHD testing, instead making her feel like a troubled child. After the teacher's attempts at fixing the problem of Beyonce's restlessness by placing her in the silent corner were unsuccessful, the teacher came up with a new and even more embarrassing, humiliating plan called Beyonce's behavior jar. This jar was meant to track good and bad behavior. Good behavior would be rewarded with a marble in the jar, and bad behavior would be met with the removal of a marble in the jar. When the jar was full, Beyonce would receive a reward. Now, in theory, it doesn't sound too terrible. It's clearly not good, but it's not the worst thing, right? Well, here's the catch. Beyonce was the only one in the class who had a behavior jar, and it wasn't a private thing either. Anytime the teacher wanted to award or remove a marble from the jar, she announced it to the entire class. Beyonce's main focus in class became not causing a disturbance, instead of what it should have been, fulfilling her own academic and intellectual curiosity. For years, her ADHD went undiagnosed and was treated in the same manner as a character flaw or a personality flaw. And whether this is a result of our gendered view of mental illnesses such as ADHD or our general negative view of mental illness, either way, it is problematic. It was not until after her freshman year of high school that Beyonce's parents told her that they wanted to have her tested for ADHD. Despite her symptoms, by this time, Beyonce had internalized the stigma she had experienced, so much so that her initial reaction was, "Why do my parents think that there's something wrong with me?" And when she found out that she did indeed have ADHD, her reaction was similar. "Why is there something wrong with me?" She began to feel less valuable as a person, and while her perspective on ADHD and her diagnosis has certainly changed, her initial reaction was one of a stigma that taught her that mental illness was something inherently, fundamentally wrong with a person instead of what it is, an illness. It's important that we recognize this, and it's important that we see that this happens constantly. Although Beyonce's story is one of ADHD, this treatment and this type of characterization extends to many more conditions, and this is only one of many stories. Part of the problem derives from one of our main sources of information, or in this case, misinformation, which is popular media and news. Unfortunately, far too often these sources misrepresent mental illness as a terrible thing, and they usually do this out of a reflection of our society's fear and misunderstanding of mental illness, or in a reflection of our society's trivialization of these issues. And both of these things are problematic. However, it's also important to be cognizant of the progress that we have made in this area and in the larger battle against stigma as well. Newer shows such as Homeland, which portrays a fully functional bipolar woman, may not be perfect, but they're a heck of a lot better than the old ones. And culturally, some things have changed too. When my mom was growing up, she would never mention to anyone that her mother was bipolar, or my grandmother. She would not tell her friends, not even her closest friends knew, definitely not acquaintances, and sometimes not even family. Even if she had told them, it's likely that they wouldn't have known what bipolarity was. The fact that I am able to stand up here today and tell all of you that there is someone close in my family who is struggling with mental illness, and that many of you know what that mental illness is, that in itself is a sign of progress. And I'm sure I'm not the only one here with the connection to mental illness. I would bet that almost every person in this room is connected to mental illness in some way, whether it's a family member, a friend, a brother, a sister, if it's the person themselves. Regardless of your connection to the issue, we can all be a part of the solution. We need to stop treating mental illness as a taboo. Educate yourself on different issues and injustices surrounding different conditions, and don't buy into false stereotypes proliferated by anyone, especially media. Remember that mental illness does not define a person. It is not a choice, and it can't just be shaken off or forgotten. This is especially important to recognize in a teenage setting where far too often real issues and real mental illnesses are written off as a product of hormones or puberty. It's part of the reason why suicide is still the third leading cause of death in people under 18. Those with mental illness can live extremely successful lives, especially when treated. Billy Joel has major depression. Lady Gaga has bulimia and anorexia. Demi Lovato has bipolar disorder. Abraham Lincoln, for crying out loud, had major depression. These people were all extremely successful, and all around us there are people living with mental illness, living extremely successful lives. But Robin Williams, Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, Sylvia Plath, and countless others have had their lives stolen by mental illness. It's time to redefine mental health. It's time to look between the lines of this issue and start having real conversations. It's time to speak up. Thank you.